So I spent the last week in Chicago at the DNC, but I wasn't covering the convention, I was covering the riots outside. I flew in Monday afternoon and met protesters in Union Park where they had gathered in massive numbers. And they were met with some counter-protesters, particularly people from Generation Zion who came carrying signs with Dietrich Bonhoeffer's face. Bonhoeffer is a German Lutheran pastor who lived in Germany during World War II. He attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler on 3 different occasions. He was eventually sent to a concentration camp and executed in 1943. The protesters marched from Union Park to the DNC security perimeter. The march remained mostly peaceful, despite the fact that they did carry Jihad and Hamas flags, as well as signs that say, "I stand with Hamas." And I got a chance to interview some of those people. What's your headband?
This is the headband for the military wing responsible for the resistance operations in Gaza.
Hamas?
Yeah.
Okay, you support Hamas?
I do.
Why do you support Hamas?
So I would support any and all resistance operations that fight for the freedom of our country, for the freedom of Palestine.
Does that include October 7th?
Yes.
Hey man, I just wanted to ask you why you support Hamas.
Because I'm Hamas.
Because you're Hamas? What does that mean?
Oh, every Palestinian is Hamas.
Do you support Hamas 100%?
$1,000,000%.
When they got to the DNC security perimeter, they stormed it. So how it worked was there was a big metal fence in front of us, then a street, and then another big metal fence with police on the other side of it, just in front of the United Center, which is where the convention was being held. So the rioters stormed that first fence, filed into the street, and then tried to storm the second fence, but were warded off by police officers behind it with OC spray. Eventually, the police marched through the street and made arrests. I was actually very impressed with Chicago PD. There were a couple incidents where I was disappointed, but for the most part, they handled the situation very well. By contrast, the LAPD will pretty much just let anything go. They watched me get beat up, bear sprayed, attacked, they did nothing. After they made arrests, the protest was dispersed. The protesters also formed an encampment that day at Union Park, which was also dispersed. On Tuesday, they gathered at the Israeli consulate. The numbers were far fewer this time. I'd put it somewhere from 150 to 200 people. The police blocked in the street where they were protesting. The protesters formed up in the center of that street and then launched a full frontal offensive on the police at one end of the street. That offensive obviously failed. They scuffled, arrests were made, and then they tightened their ranks, formed up in the center again, and attacked the police on the other side of the street. It quickly devolved into pure mayhem. As the night went on, they found a hole in police ranks and they marched through the streets. They totally took the streets over. At one point, there was a taxi who was just driving down the street. They totally encircled the taxi and forced it to drive backwards. Being that taxi driver must have been terrifying. Clashes with the police continued on the march as they attempted to follow the protesters and block them in. Eventually, the protesters blocked themselves into the inlet of a cafe where police systematically arrested them. There was a lot of violence, a lot of attacks on the police during this time, but by the time it was all said and done, the Chicago Police Department loaded those folks up into vans and took them away. On Wednesday, they gathered again in Union Park, and for a while it was rather boring. They formed up, they marched down the streets, there was no violence, until a group of those protesters bolted into a train station in Chicago. Naturally, I followed after them. They went onto a train platform and started attacking police officers. And this is super dangerous. All it takes is one slip and somebody dies. You fall onto the tracks and you're done. Luckily, that didn't happen, but they did attack the police on the platform, and so the police arrested them, carried them out of the train station, and absolute chaos enveloped. The entire station was completely surrounded from the inside and the outside. There were very few officers inside the station. And hundreds of people surrounding them both inside and outside, banging on the glass, throwing things at the cops, screaming at them, but eventually they gave up and they moved forward. They continued on the march and they went back to Union Park. The protest pretty much concluded and dissolved. Now, I left on Thursday, but this seems to have been pretty close to the worst day. They took over the streets again, just like they did on Tuesday, but this time when they surrounded cars occupied by people just probably trying to go home from work, they smashed their windows in. The police pushed those people back into their cars and told them to leave. They surrounded the perimeter outside the DNC again. They burned flags. They harassed, heckled, and attacked people who left the convention, and it seemed like this day, although I wasn't there, there was a much lesser police presence. When I got home, I went to a protest in Seattle yesterday, and I'm going to talk about that in the next video, so make sure to stay tuned, make sure to subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date with the Today is America website. Thanks, guys.